Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. I am thrilled today to be joined by my friend Steve, who has been on many adventures with me climbing on Mount Sophia. He is a wonderful climbing partner, and I'm very grateful for you, Steve, and for the time that we've been together. And then for the first time, I get to be joined by John Vervaeke on my channel, and I am so thankful to have you here with me. I would say in my journey, my journey is characterized by finding people who are much wiser than I am and attempting to engage with them. And you have done so much to lead me into the paths of wisdom. And I mean that both in terms of engagement with your content, your recorded content, but there were also, I would say, qualitative shifts in my experience as a consequence of actually getting to talk to you, even through this medium. And so things like the Socratic midwifery and these ideas are very alive for me, because I feel in some ways I've experienced that. As a consequence of the generosity and the kindness that you've shown towards me. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for saying that, Ken. I'm very happy to be here. I'm really happy to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
And Steve, I know this is the first time you have met John, so I don't know if you want to say a little bit about yourself and before we get started.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, John, the meaning crisis has been just profound for, I think, anyone who's engaged with it with the fullness of their own being. Excuse me, and it's helped many do so reciprocally more powerfully through that process. So, for me, I came to the meaning crisis through, I think I had explored it a little bit before and like revisited it through Ken, because Ken has actually been a great partner in my journey and reinterpreting my understandings, because I grew up in a Protestant home, and I didn't find that for me I could onboard the lessons. I could power my curiosity is really what it was, the way that I wanted to. And so my path kind of led me more towards Buddhism later in my life, and my journey with Ken, I've kind of joked that it's like a Rubik's Cube, in the sense that I never solved one. But just being able to see someone else have later had actually solved it has brought a lot of peace to me, knowing that Christianity has the answers. The tradition that I was born in and raised in has the answers in a way that wasn't being presented to me, but that depth is there. So Ken has been, a rehoming process for me in a certain sense, although my own personal path was more towards science, and my way of coming to this place was really through a personal study of physics and consciousness, and understanding actually how when you push on both sides of reality, you fall through. And so I just opened there.
That's well said. Thank you for sharing that.
Wonderful. So as I said before we started recording, my hope for this conversation is that we can just wander together. As John, you have been such an incredible guide to so many. I would like to defer first to you and ask if whatever seems alive to you or seems salient that you might be interested in a thread of running after, and we can maybe find what comes out between us and follow it where we go.
Yeah, I guess the things that are most alive for me are typically where I'm following the logos in my work and what's opening up for me, and some of this is in After Socrates, especially the episode on Theurgia, which is still coming, and then the talk I gave at Cambridge, and then some of the other work I've been doing. I'm very interested in trying to work out carefully the relationship between imaginal practices and ritual knowing, and what is the kind of and so this is a whole topic that philosophers and anthropologists have been exploring. What's the kind of knowing that's going on in ritual? And as you can expect, I'm very attracted to that because it's non-propositional, yet it's all ultimately playing a crucial role. So I'm trying to draw together notions of the imaginal, serious play. How do we determine if a ritual is a good ritual? What's the difference between just a practice and a ritual? These are the things I'm exploring and I'm trying to understand, because these are the ways in which we can more properly engage non-propositional knowing and our embodied cognition, rather than just our analytic cognition, our abstract analytic cognition, our embodied cognition in processes of transformation. And of course, all of the traditions, and one of the things we forget is that the academy was right beside the gymnasium, right? And Plato's a wrestler and Socrates is a soldier, and he's also probably doing. And they just took that for granted, but we let that drop away. And of course, in Taoism and Buddhism, especially in Taoism, the embodied practices, like I consider, and I can talk about why I think this and what it means and what it shouldn't be, what it should not be taken to mean. I consider the practice of Tai Chi properly a ritual. And I'm trying to understand how we can recover that whole constellation, configurations, perhaps a better word, of things, in order to help people get back into the taste of the love of wisdom. And I'll remind people that even Pascal, after he ran his famous wager, he didn't expect it to convince you. All he wanted it to get you to do was to go to church and light a candle, which is to engage it. All he wanted to do was get it to the point where a ritual would seem intellectually respectable to you, because he had the confidence that it was the rituals that would actually bring about the transformation. And we always leave out the second half of Pascal's wager, and I'd like to bring it back into full discussion. And why that's pertinent for all of us is we all share a history of Protestantism, which tended to put a lot of pressure on reducing ritual and criticizing ritual. And we're all the children of Freud, where we've been brought up in a culture that ritual is a neurotic or otherwise meaningless action. And of course, other religions and religious philosophies like Taoism, Buddhism, ritual plays a tremendous role. And so trying to bring that back in. I mean, isn't that actually really appropriate for a channel that's entitled Climbing Mount Sophia? I mean, it seems like that should be something. And so that's something I'm doing a lot of cog-sci work on, a lot of discussing, a lot of presenting of ideas, working it into various courses I'm teaching. And that's what I'm really alive to right now. But I'm happy to, I mean, that's the one thing. And the other thing I'm really alive to is this ongoing, I hope, plausible proposal that Neoplatonism is once again a very vital and viable framework for us. And I've released a video on that recently, etc. And those two are not orthogonal. They are actually just two different poles on the same sort of thing I'm working with. And we don't have to talk about any of that, but that's what's alive for me right now.
Yes, and I want to first of all thank you for noticing the aspect of the channel name and how that ties in there, because I think for me, so much that the embodied participation with the logos is what I'm trying to get at, in that sense of the symbol and enacting the symbol of climbing on Mount Sophia. And what's been alive for me that ties in, I think, with what you're saying is I'm so much interested in trying to understand the places within myself where actions come from that are not the ones that I intellectually desire and make sense of. And so ritual seems to be, and that ritual self-transcendence, or the self-transcendence that can happen in ritual and an embodied movement seems to be playing a role there in the places that I'm able. The example that I have engaged a few times is I don't really find drinking alcohol that useful anymore. At a party, maybe a little bit, but especially when I go out to eat just with my wife or something, I don't want to order a drink because I don't think it serves much purpose, and it just is kind of a waste of money in my mind. And I feel that, and I believe that, and then I go to eat with my wife the other day and I order a drink because it sounds fun in the moment, and so I do it. and then I'm trying to understand this kind of thing. Why am I doing it? So it seems to me that this ritual aspect of self-transcendence is very much tied up with moving out of the space of simply assenting to propositions or rationalizing around a set of ideas.
Yeah, if I can just reply to that before Steve. So virtue for Aristotle is ultimately dependent on having developed habits. And then if you turn to the Confucian tradition and somewhat the Taoist tradition, the way you best train habits is through ritual. Ritual is the training of habits. Those habits will allow you most properly inhabit your roles as the roles for which you bear responsibility. And so there's a direct line from virtue to habit to ritual, and then back up to virtue. And so, we forget how much we are outside the Cartesian center in our head. And ritual and the Aristotelian, Neoplatonic, Confucian, Taoist tradition, Buddhist traditions are all about trying to properly, and I mean rationally, because I have an extended sense of rationality, rationally train train those aspects of ourselves. And that's what I'm trying to understand, what ritual is, how ritual has that function, how it could have that function, and how we can make judgments about what's a good ritual, what's a bad ritual, etc. And now I'll shut up.
Well, what comes to me when both of you were speaking there is this sense of an unspeakable place or unspeakable motion. And I think that, I think, John, you used Rafe Kelly as a movement coach or some practice of some sort. Tai Chi you were speaking about as well.
Yep.
In a certain sense, Ken, we've talked about stances. Really the conducting of the mind is a series of stances, or a dance of stances flowing into each other of the different informational flows that are available to you. And I think ritual is a physical motion, or I'm suggesting perhaps ritual is a physical motion that implies a mental motion in the same way. And I'm getting part of this just for context from Locke Kelly, who's been the most powerful meditation teacher that I've interacted with. His pointing out instructions essentially are, in my view, a physical mapping of the motions that we ought to undertake in order to essentially, if you get into the spiritual definitions of it, kind of take the divine order, in a sense, hold yourself in the right position so that the information flow lines up through the recursion that you are. So you can align your incoming and outcoming with the universe as a through line.
So, Steve, so what like, there's different ways I can understand the alignment, and maybe you mean all of them, or none of them, or some of them. One is, there's an alignment about agency. Vellman brings this out when he talks about the way of the wanton, and he actually talks about getting into the flow state, and about Wu Wei, which is, not doing, but it does not, right? But it doesn't mean it doesn't mean inactivity. And one is you can be so you can be reactively immersed in your world, and he calls that being a wanton. Like, somebody's wanton, they just give into their impulses, and then he says that undermines your agency, because you have conflicting you're so complex, you have conflicting contradicting impulses, and then you'll rip yourself to shreds. You'll be at constant cross purposes. And then he says you move up, and that's sort of Frankfurt's move. You move up a level of reflection, and you identify with these, and you disidentify with those. and you start to bring coherence. And then you might be tempted to think that what you do is you continue going up in reflection. And then he says, no, because if you go too high, you end up as Hamlet and what he calls the reflectiveness gap, and your agency is destroyed because you have paralysis by analysis, right? And he says what you want is you don't just want to find the median point, because you have to be able to like adjust. But he talks about you want to have the immersion of the wanton, and you want to have the flexibility of Hamlet. And he proposes the Taoist state, the Taoist sage that can get into the flow state as an example of that. The trying not to try, that is nevertheless, as you said, there's an interpenetrating, interfording relationship between the movement of the mind and the movement of the body. And so you are deeply at one with the world, but you nevertheless have a grace and a freedom with respect to it. There's a coherence to what you're doing. Now that's one way I hear that alignment. I'll stop here. Is that landing with you as part of what you meant, or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's another part to it, I think, where the motions, I guess because of what you're saying, the motions physically can be mapped mentally. And the
Yes.
reason it's hard to speak to is because it uses, I'm putting forward perhaps that it uses the part of your brain that motion that is so much more capable, so much more complex, that's why we're able to do this. When you are able to put your presence into that part of your brain or
Yes.
body, that capacity begins to come to you, because now you aren't in the world where you're a thing and other things are other things. You are kind of shaping yourself or understanding yourself as a shape better.
Yeah.
Which, if you're reciprocally forming with the world, the degree to which you understand your shape is obviously immensely powerful and valuable. True. And so many of the psychotechnologies I've heard you talk about in the Meaning Crisis and your other works seem to be ways of taking different views of your own shape, and therefore triangulating and confirming to yourself what you are with a truth that can't be self-deceiving. Yeah, ideally.
Okay, so for me, that's wonderful. Thank you. For me, that brings up properly the imaginal. The imaginal is exactly that. I mean, that's how it's supposed to bridge between the intellectual and sensual. It's supposed to bridge between the subjective and the objective, between the first person and the third person points of view. That's what the imaginal does. Like when I'm doing Tai Chi, I think I know what you mean. I'm not just moving, and I'm not just moving sort of with the dead hand of habit. What's like you said, there's a movement, and then there's something imaginal. I'm not forming pictures in my mind, right? That's the difference between the imaginaries that you form pictures in your mind. Yeah, right. And then the imaginal is a way of using the imagination in order to augment your perception and your conception and your inhabiting of your body and the world. And so, yes, I know what you mean. There's a way in which I'm doing Tai Chi in my mind, but it's not in the introspective space where I'm looking at mental images. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, and that movement may still help you later get into that space because there's a shared similarity with
exactly.
Yes,
there's an interaffordance, which is, and this goes into very sophisticated models of generative modeling, flowing up and flowing down, and yet that flowing up and flowing down maps again, like you just said, onto Vellman's. So this for me is the imaginal, but for me there is I want to add something in here. There's two dimensions to the imaginal. There is this kind of vertical, although it has resonance with the world as part of its thing. But there's another dimension of the imaginal as horizontal, which is the aspirational. Right? You're in the ritual not just to remain as you are, but to open yourself up, to aspire to a transformation. And that's also imaginal. And there's lots of research showing that the way you bind the current self to the future self is imaginally, and that's really, and then that brings up some really interesting points, because I'm not going to repeat the arguments. The imaginal is central to the aspirational. The aspirational is central to the rational. Therefore, the imaginal is central to the rational. But I think the reverse is also the case. You can judge about whether or not an imaginal practice, let's say a ritual, is rational or not. And this is where the work of Jennings and Williams and Boyd and Schilbrack and others, they have this notion that what a ritual is doing, and it can't be replaced by anything else. It can't even be replaced by myth or drama, right? It non-reductively gives you a way of fitting yourself to the world, and also when that way of fitting becomes like a work of art, fitting yourself to the way of fitting, like a masterpiece, right? And you're getting this so you get this weird, everybody knows this, it's the paradox of ritual. Ritual is the thing that should never change, but it is constantly evolving, right? Which is really, really interesting, right? And so what you can do is you can judge how well a ritual is in terms of how broadly does it transfer to non-ritualized parts of your life, and how deeply does it afford you having insight into those particular domains when you're there. That's a very good ritual. And let me give you an example, and it makes otherwise really bizarre behavior very, very clear. So I'm reading, what's his name? Ziglatus's new book on ritual. And he's a cognitive scientist, by the way. He's not like a religious studies person or anything, but he's been studying fire walking, where people walk on coals. And there is no, I mean, in the fantasy sense of the word, there's no magic to it. What it is, and this is what's really, really cool, and think about everything we've been saying here, is it's a question of very, very precise timing. Because coal actually conducts heat, the embers actually conduct heat relatively slowly. Now, if you walk too fast, you will stir them up and you will get burnt. And if you walk too slowly, the heat will penetrate fast enough and you'll start to burn. And so it's a matter of exquisite timing. And then you can think, and what you see when the people go into this is they get into a state of they get into a flow state for that timing, because they have to bring complete mindfulness and they have to completely inhabit their bodies, right? Because the timing depends on a sophisticated coordination of your whole body. If you let your shoulders move too far forward, you'll start to walk too fast, right? It's this engrossing, encompassing timing. And then you sit back and you think, wow, could skills of really mindful timing transfer broadly and deeply in my life? Yeah, yes. They really, really could. So this bizarre behavior that Enlightenment people would look at and say, silly superstition, you get, oh, no, this is actually this is ratio. This is the proper proportioning of religio, your connectedness through the timing. This is ratio religio, and it transfers broadly and deeply in people's lives. And so not only is ritual a part of rationality, there is a way in which we can bring rational judgments to bear and say, this is a good ritual, that's a bad ritual. And I take it that the neurotic rituals, which is what we've collapsed ritual to, the Freudian rituals, are precisely the opposite. They are so irrational because they are so bound just to that particular situation. So think of somebody with OCD and they have to count the number of times they walk out of the apartment before they can leave or something. They have to do it like 5 times, starting with the right. That doesn't transfer. That's the whole point. So you can put on a poll these rituals that have survived, and you can see, oh wow, look what it's actually doing. And then on the other pole is the neurotic, and you say what precisely makes it neurotic is that it does not have this kind of transfer at all. In fact, the ritual tends to have a negative effect for OCD, because as they do the ritual here, the anxiety leaps to other things, and they have to come up with other rituals in other domains. And so it's exactly the opposite. So that's an argument I'm building. How does that land with both of you?
I think very well for me. I think of, one of the biggest things that was coming up for me as you were saying that was just this way in which, again, relating it to this issue I'm having of trying to understand these almost like parallel levels that I'm existing on. There's this way in which when I'm in the flow state, or when I'm really present in my own life, when I'm fitted with the world, there's like, I'm reading Spinoza's Religion right now, and that the way he
what a wonderful book. Claire's such a great thinker. Oh my gosh. Her book on Kierkegaard is really good too, by the way.
I just finished that. I love her writing. But the way she talks about his understanding of senti intuitiva,
yeah,
as this, it's this unbelievably simple thing that's underneath everything else, and it's this kind of connectedness that is happening. I feel as if I experienced that when I'm in the flow state. But one of the things that immediately brings me out of that is this need to represent in images what I experienced in order to transmit it to someone else in language. And that's this thing where it's like there's a layer that gets transposed, right? I'm no longer experiencing where I really am. I'm no longer adaptively fitted with all this exaptation of the machinery that is my own body and balance and coordination and all this timing that comes online when I'm connected with being. That then you interpose this space of bringing it, like, and Steve and I have talked about this a lot as being an attempt to either collapse time or pull time apart, like pull something from a past moment into this moment instead of being in this moment, or projecting onto the future some frame of what it needs to be. And that seems to be like the deep rituals. And for me, that's a lot of rituals that I've learned from you in the ecology of practices that I do as a routine in the morning. Those bring me back down, because they're this movement out of all the space of representation.
Schubrak talks about in his work, and there's an excellent anthology called Thinking Through Ritual, which is a great play on words, because they're thinking by means of and thinking about. But he actually has an article in there entitled Ritual Metaphysics. And his argument is there's a kind of disclosure in a transformative coupling with the world. There's a disclosure of patterns of intelligibility that are not accessible except through this non-propositional way. I mean, of course, propositions can be evolved too, right? But it's really perspectival. Like McNamara talks about how rituals decenter you. You're doing a ritual often in the first, like you may be doing it from a first person perspective, but like Steve said, it's often you're doing it from almost a cosmic perspective, a third person perspective, or God's perspective, or the perspective of Shunyata or the Tao, right? And it gets you that decentering, which is also crucial to rationality, by the way. And so the idea is you can get that opening up. And for me, you see, I think the thing for Spinoza, scientia intuitiva, it's adverbial. It's not what you're seeing, it's how you're seeing. And so if you can get it, if this doesn't sound like a contradiction, scientia intuitiva is like when you're flowing, but you're flowing within sort of metaphysical contemplation, but that contemplation is not propositional, it's ritual in nature. That's how I would try and bring those two together. There is a way in which you can get a deeply profound disclosure of the dynamic structuring of intelligibility that is a metaphysical realization. And then when you do the metaphysics doesn't seem so far away from the embeddedness, because what typically happens is, for me, when I come out of that, there's an imaginal space, which again, I'm not looking at images. There's I'm seeing as Spinoza does. And then that is the space within which I don't lose that space. I hold that space, and that still has that feeling. Not that feeling, it's not the right word. It still has that sense in both senses of the word sense. It still has that sense. And then that's the framework within which I try to shape the propositional statement of a metaphysics. And that's how I understand how to practice scientia intuitiva. I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful. That maps well with me and Ken's conversations with the metaphysical you're referring to there being the time functions. If the mind is the spatial tempiospatial interface, the time functions are the transcendental, that which is around and within, and the space functions are that which separates and relates.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so, like, just to transfer a little bit of where I'm coming from there, like, a kind of a bit of Ian McGilchrist influence here, where the left brain,
Yes.
I'm trying to simplify this to an optimal grip from a software designer's perspective. Just
That's a good thing to try and do. The design perspective is always something. This is something we practice in CogSci. You should always try and bring your grandest metaphysical proposals into the design stance. Go ahead, please.
Sure, yeah. So the left brain, kind of crudely, because it's the best way for the software to grip it, not because of I'm making statements about biology. I'm not right now. I understand it would have more nuance, but that's not the point. So the left side of the brain is thinking, the right side of the brain is feeling. So in a sense, left is the optimal function of thinking is truth, and the optimal function of feeling is love. And we're really trying to synchronize the two hemispheres through the brainstem, in my opinion, because the recursions, the types of recursions within the hemispheres and within the brainstem is different, because these ones run this way, and the brainstem runs vertically. And that's how they're kind of synchronized. So this substrate, so you have thinking, feeling, and noticing being the deepest, maybe the orchestration of the deep waters of the ocean, the deepest layers. And then you're really trying to find a way to enter that space to summon or to relate to the results of your other processors, which we normally are so attached to, you think that you are them. But as you drop lower into these spaces, it's really about not content, but context. The content, marrying the context with the content, of course.
Yes.
But deepening your sense of context, all these rituals, practicing your ability to operate the time functions of your mind, because that is it's synchronizing your own integration. And when you synchronize your integration, you can understand the shape that you are and how it influences information as it's passing through you and projecting out of you.
Yes.
So it's a holistic holding with all the different views of yourself, so that you triangulate what you yourself are enough that you can put it in alignment in a relation with the world, in a sense.
So I'm going to resonate with a lot of that. Yeah, I wouldn't say thinking and feeling, but I get what you're doing there. But to the broader point, and this is something I've mentioned to Ian, he really concentrates on the left-right axis, but there's also a back-front axis, which is really important. And then, as you said, there's a bottom up, top down. There's a vertical axis, and you're trying to integrate all of those. The noticing is actually the best translation of the Greek word noesis. It's that kind of knowing, the knowing by noticing. And that became a Neoplatonism, the nous. And Spinoza's version of noesis and the nous is scientia intuitiva. So there's pretty powerful. I think this, part of what a way of bringing this together is, and this is Stegmaier's work on what is orientation. Before we start to move or navigate, we have to be properly oriented, and orienting is about this, as you said, it's noticing, it's sizing up yourself, sizing up the world. You said the shapes, and can the shapes reciprocally move toward, reciprocally open to each other? And Stegmaier, of course, is making the point that orientation is so backgrounded. It is the primordial setting of the context, and because it is so primordial, we forget that everything else depends on it. Now, for me, orientation is raw relevance realization. That's exactly what's going on there. And so I think of all of these ritual ways of accessing and accentuating the non-propositional ways of knowing, like noticing, like sizing up, and other things like that. I think these are all sort of the primary dimensions, the component process between featural and gestalt, that's left and right, and transparency and opacity, first person, third, like we have all these opponent relationships, and they're doing relevance realization. And then what you have is you've got not just an optimal grip, you've got a meta optimal gripping, right? And I'm bringing this back around to something you said a few minutes ago, which is the idea of a stance. So when you take the stance in Tai Chi, you don't actually fight with that form of your body. The point of the stance is it's a meta optimal grip. It's a place that gives you, it's optimal for getting you into particular stances, right? That give you the optimal grip on that situation or that situation or that situation or that situation.
A stance of possibility.
Yes.
Of options. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And appropriately so. And so one way I think about what rituals do, especially when they're an ecology of practices that have opponent processing, is they help us realize that primordial stance, that orientation. And the thing about that is when that is done right, that should transfer broadly and deeply. Broadly because you have to orient no matter where you go, and deeply because if you transform your orientation, you will transform everything else that's standing on top of it. And so this is how I think we can properly understand how rituals should be taken up. The problem we have, like I said, is and the Protestant Reformation bears some responsibility for this, because it's scripture over sacrament, which is a definite hierarchy, which has been used. I don't know if it has to be, but it definitely has been used oppressively, so that the ritual and the enacted. The church I grew up in, if people swayed while they were singing, everybody got upset because that might be dancing. And dancing is evil, right? There was an old joke that, the people in the church wouldn't say it. It was said about people in the church that they wouldn't be caught. They wouldn't be caught making love standing up for fear that someone might think that they're dancing, right? And so, and then, like I said, Freud took that up and took that denigration of rituals are just meaningless superstitions into they're meaningful, but they're meaningful as neurotic expressions, right? And so
I think this theory, if you're not like being as them as you're doing them, right? It has to sink deeply enough into you that as you're doing the ritual, you're operating from that orchestral space, or it is meaningless. Like, it has to go that deep to have purpose, but it does have profound purpose. Yeah.
I think it has to go that deep, Steve, but I think, to quote the Psalms, it has to be deep calling to deep. It has to go that deep and also disclose what is deep in the world. So the question I want to pose to you, both of you now, because I want to sort of think aloud with both of you about it. This is good theory, and it's theory that meshes with practice, but how do we properly enact it? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for how we recommend to people? And I mean this really concretely, design principles again. How do we use this to recommend to people what rituals they should take up? Because all of this will remain theory if it can't translate into good counsel and good education about the taking up of ritual. Because all that we're then doing is we're doing all this theory, and then people will just go out and this feels good. That will be the standard, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
I think you've pointed to it in your works before. Sorry, John. The ecology of practices. Please. Sorry, with the ecology of practices, because it's not a single stance that you need to take, because it's not a single view you need to take. It's a series of motions that your ritual set has to effectively prepare you for the triathlon or decathlon of life. All individual sports have to be not just optimized individually, but optimized given you're going to run them in a line, in a specific line. And so I think thinking about the sequence of, you can think of your experience as a sequence of moments and where you are in it, and thinking of the stances you can be. So you have this spatial sense of like your stance where you are, but then temporally you have a flow to that.
Yes.
And so that's dancing, right? So what poses are you hitting, and what order are you doing it mentally? That's your fluency. That's mental fluency through kind of catching the fireballs and throwing them back from the cosmos, in a sense, right?
Yeah. One of the things, and I think, I very much agree with what Steve said, but I want to maybe just muddy the waters here a little bit as part of this, because as you well know, John, like my experience is writing this line between kind of Christianity and how that remains true for me, but also the ways in which I've been, I don't know, I see it having gone so wrong in so many ways. And it comes to me, the question that's coming up as you're talking about how do we, it's to me, your question is almost, how do we call people into this, right? And I've been kind of, I've been allowing the difficulty of that. There's a dialectic that you had a little bit with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau in a conversation a little while ago about the narrative being primary ontologically. And then it came up in Chris Maestro-Pietro and I's conversation a little bit. And I recently went around again with Paul Vanderklay on it. And I've at first it really bothered me. And then I've just been working with it. And to me, this like ritual might be this place where like, it's like a narrative can bring you, a narrative only matters from my side. Narratives almost, it feels like narratives primary from the side of me as an individual finite being. And it can maybe bring me to the place of enacting the ritual. And then in the ritual, I'm actually really there, kind of like Steve is saying, and I'm becoming, I'm allowing the ritual to take me over in a sense, and thus I'm being disclosed to the world, and the world is disclosing itself to me. That then the narrative can drop away, and that's the point. So I guess I'm kind of, I'm kind of putting this issue of the narrative and the non-narrative as ontological primaries, situating it in relation to this ritual question, and I guess maybe asking the question to you, John, how that lands.
That lands very well, because I do think of the ritual as proper. I mean, like I said, the propositions are involved, but it's not operating propositionally. And the one of the consensus points from all these thinkers is the non-reducibility of ritual to myth or to drama, which are the two original kinds of, narrativizations of our experience, right? Mythos and drama, and they're woven together in various. And the temptation has always been to put ritual totally in the service of myth or drama. And then they make the argument that gets things exactly the wrong way around. Ritual is non-reducible to myth and narrative, and many people like Ziglatis and others point out that ritual precedes us in speciation. Animals engage in ritual. There's really weird rituals amongst chimps. I forget where it is in Africa, and what the chimps, there's this particularly odd tree, and no matter what they're doing, at some point in the week, or maybe it's even the day, I think, they will go and they will place a rock at the bottom of the tree, of this weird tree, and it's clearly not helping them reproduce or hunt and so there's like, and then of course there's even mating rituals on other species, and even if they're instinctively driven, there's something in there about how ritual and sentience and sapience co-evolved together. So it's very, very deep. It's clearly pre-linguistic, and it's clearly, I think, pre-mythos and pre-drama. So what you said lands very clearly with me. And I think that's why Jonathan, by the way, came around and acknowledged. He said, I think John is right that the nomological is deeper than that. And I think because he's aware of, because Eastern Orthodoxy ritual is such a pregnant and present thing for Eastern Orthodoxy. So that lands with me. Part of my question was, how do we invite people into ritual? But part of my question is also, what guidance can we, and Steve answered this also in one dimension. Both of these answers are right. I'm not excluding them. I want to say there's something, see if there's something more. I think the design principles like opponent processing and properly layering and like Steve says, you have to have a proper program, what's going to be the proper progression so that you're flowing through. And I've talked about all of that. And then I tried to give people sort of external markers, right? Pay attention to how other people are noticing your transformations. Those are better. But I'm trying to also give people, and what I want to propose is all of these are essential. And if you're not using any one of these, you're opening yourself up to self-deception in some ways. But the more of these you include, so I want to keep everything we've said, like really keep it. Everything we've said is essential. But I want to also say, well, what would be the markers within? What would be the experiential? And I come to this one last because our temptation is always to make this first. And so only after these others are properly explained, like here's questions. Like, should you be getting into the flow state when you're doing a ritual? Should you experience, a tremendous sense of decentering? Like, are there phenomenological markers? And I want to say it one more time, crystal clear. The phenomenological markers are not primary. They are not, you can't use them in replace of everything else. They are one among all these other components that have to also be in place for you to judge. Right? And right, you want to see if it's transferring broadly, and what other people say about you is a good marker of that. Is it transferred broadly and deeply? But what are the now once we put up this huge bulwark that is well reinforced against a slip into subjective romanticism, what should we tell people what should be the phenomenological features that they should look for a good ritual as opposed to an empty ritual or an erotic ritual?
You said so many things there. I just want to hit on one point that might just be a bookmark for later, but I believe that what the narrative is the forward direction, the brainstem to the neocortex and back, and it drives us forward. So I just wanted to put that somewhere because I think that that's why we need it, because if you walk forward with just your narrative, with just your action that has its baseless action, that's one thing. But if you transcend and then go through your narrative and take action, that's a much more holistic, hyperbolic sense. And so
I agree. I think narrative is very important for establishing temporal non-logical identity, a relationship between your present and future self.
And also why narrative is not enough helps me answer your actual question, which is, I think your ecology of practices, in my opinion, should be tying together two dimensions always. If you're practicing something that's one dimension, there is a utility to that, but it's not at the base level of integration, right?
Right.
If you're looking for measures, I would say synthesis, integration, your ability to do those things and do those things in totally different contexts and different time flows. That's where I think ritual is really ultimately pointing us towards our ability to pull everything together. And so if you're thinking of the spatial dimensions of the mind, ritual should really be just like Christianity is tying the vertical and the horizontal together.
Yeah.
So that good. you could do cross-referencing and triangulate better.
Yeah, and I actually bring that out. I hadn't put that quite as a criteria because after Socrates, I've been talking about the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of dialectic into Dialogos, and then you get the diagonal, the resonance. But that's between those two. But that's exactly right. Not only are they features, we should make them as criteria, right? A good ritual is you're enacting. You're not just thinking about, you're enacting the vertical and the horizontal in a mutually resonant fashion. I think, that's very good. That's very helpful.
If we understand the transcendental, like spatially, it's hyperbolic function. I'll give you a second, John. Sorry, I didn't know.
Yeah, just sorry. I wanted to make sure I just want to make sure that I'm not running over time. I have more time, so please. I'm sorry for being that. I want to keep going, so I thought, oh no, I don't want to end this.
Great. Yeah. So if we're trying to come to an understanding of what we're doing here, we're in a sense, I think, trying to teach our mind how to operate recursively, hyperbolically.
Yeah,
which is to be self-penetrating, containing, suspending, and animating, right? So essentially by stitching together the axes, we can improve our sense of the shape that we are.
Yes.
Bring ourselves, by understanding the time, understanding how we transition between the views that we can take on the space that we are, we can pull ourselves into a wholeness, a higher dimensionality to operate within, around and within ourselves that isn't accessible if we're not synchronizing our processors in a way that lets the juggling, it's really a juggling, take place.
I want that first of all, thank you. That's great. That's excellent. And I want to first of all, you keep invoking this imaginal, the shape that you are, and I take it that it helps realizing this helps shape you to the world, and also makes you realize how the world is shaping you. I take it that that's all going into that notion. So, right. It's a dynamic shape that you are, is what I'm saying. It's not some sort of static. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah. Well, in any moment you become a static thing because thoughts can only. But anyway, yes.
Yeah. But the shape you are, and so for me, I like this because, like I say, this is very much an instance of the imaginal, and you're using it at sort of the meta-optimal grip level, which I think is really appropriate. Because the shape that you are, that's very good. And it's simultaneously a mental and physical shaping. We've already talked about that. Can you tell me a little bit?
Maybe the shape and its transformation, right? Because it's not just the shape; it's the flow. So it's the shape and the operation that you're performing on the shape to become the next shape. And so that is your
shape shifting you are.
The shape shifting you are, Your ideal or your imaginal is the operations that you'll undertake to become the next shape. In that sense.
I like that. I'm gonna try and remember too that I got this from you because it helped, like this idea of the final thing came out between all of us, the shape shifting that you are. Which is again probably why there's a universal mythogram of shapeshifters.
To layer on something from your After Socrates series here, like the second episode of Socrates the Monstrous, this is exactly how Socrates, like one of the things I'm doing when I'm listening to After Socrates is I'm going into a meditative space and like moving down the layers of my cognition, and with noise canceling headphones to listen to you go through this, because then I can be there.
Thank you for doing that. Can I interrupt for thank you for doing that. Wow, thank you so much. Keep going, please.
No, absolutely. I mean, thank you, because it's amazing, right? Because basically we go into this mental landscape and I watch you show me things, right? And you bring in different people and they talk to each other, right? And so, but Socrates is like this character that plays on the edge, and he's always moving between things, right? And he's always like reminding you that you don't know what it is yet.
Yes.
But Socrates is the divine dialogue in that sense, operating through,
Yes, and that will come out. I mean, eventually the series will turn off of Socrates, and it will turn and it will more and more figure on and foreground the reverse engineering of the ecology of practices that afford dialectic into Dialogos. That's what then becomes the focal point of the series.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to your question, John, and see if I can do my own phenomenology of like practices, because there's a part of me that wants to say, like, I've had so many profound experiences in and through the rituals that I've engaged, through meditation and contemplation and even movement things. And the phenomenology is sometimes so profound, like this sense of deepening, and this sense of I get this sense of like my heart being on fire is the best way I can say it. Like it just this sense of energy that comes out. And so I want to point to that and be like, I do think there's a point that maybe that comes, but at the same time, I want to hold that very carefully, because I also recognize there's a lot of times that it's almost the opposite for me in my rituals, where it's a struggle, and I'm constantly like
Yes.
I'll notice myself. I'll be meditating, or I'll be praying, and all of a sudden, I'll be sitting there in meditation, and I'll just I just, because I'm overwhelmed by my own like
Yeah.
wildness in my mind. And so it's so strange, because it's almost like you need both, and
You do.
you need to feel both. So the phenomenology is so tricky.
Okay, good. So there's the two dimensions, but there's these two moments. And you know that moments means something different in phenomenology. It doesn't mean like just a moment. It means like
Modes or something, or
yeah, like sort of not dimensions, aspects, maybe is closest, but that's not quite right either. But anyways, remember I said there's two parts to a ritual, and they're in opponent processing. There's one where you're shaping the ritual so it fits better, and this is the improv aspect. And then there's one where you're shaping yourself to the ritual, right? And then and for me, those moments, I used to tell my students, enjoy the wonderful flow moments, but the moments where you're actually moving the most are the resistance moments. And the flow moments are actually telling you that you've actually undergone the transformation, right? And they're needed, they're important. And yeah, so you want, and the Dark Night of the Soul and that sort of perennial thing. Yes, we want the phenomenology to include, I think Steve's right. I think it should always be that sense of the proper engagement of the horizontal and vertical dimensions in shape shifting. If I can do that as a quick way of summarizing. But I think there's also a sense in which people should, I mean, it's almost like, no, it's not yin and yang, but there's times when a ritual is very flowing, and then because basically you're shaping the ritual, right? And then there's times like when the musician is trying to play the masterpiece, Beethoven's Seventh or something, and the Allegro, and they have to go through, and it's hard because they're trying to shape themselves to it, and that is also a proper moment of ritual. And what we need is like in both the horizontal and the vertical have to be engaged. That doesn't drop away, but one is very flowing and the other is very, very taxing. And then what I would say is something like you are properly engaging with a ritual if you are touching both of these poles in a tonos, a creative tension and opponent processing, and you're constantly toggling an optimal grip between them. And that should be in your phenomenology as well. How does that land for both of you?
Super powerfully. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, well, one of the things that comes on for me is from the Christian framework, right? The idea of dying and resurrecting.
Yes.
Because it's very much how I experience it. It's like, and this also plays into how attention seems to work with the world in adaptive fittedness. It's like,
yes,
I have to like feel into the shape that's available for me, and then the parts of me that don't fit that shape have to be burned away, let's say,
yes,
before I can feel into the shape. But once I'm in the shape, then I like how you talk about it, switching between the ritual making me and me making the ritual, because then the shift can happen to where once I'm properly fitted, now I can disclose myself to the world, maybe is the right way to say it. And reality takes shape toward the good because I'm properly fitted. But it's like there's something about it that I always want to make it that the suffering comes first, because I need the world to disclose itself to me almost first before I can disclose myself to the world. Otherwise, I'm going to be disconnected.
Yeah, Ruchnik in The Tragedy of Reason, he talks about how there's a deep interconnect. He's basically defending Socrates against the critiques of Nietzsche and Nussbaum that Socrates is a rational optimist and he doesn't have any understanding of of the dark and of the tragic. And, Nietzsche explicitly said that, Socrates abandoned the tragedy, and, we abandoned Sophocles for Socrates. And I think, and this has become a very prevalent view of Socrates, and it's almost completely wrong. Ruchik is, not only is there a lot of scholarship to show that, Socrates is really concerned with the Dionysian. Socrates is really concerned with our human limitations, our capacity to fall, etc. But Ruchik is also saying what the logos is properly understood as tragic. And this goes to Hyland's idea. Logos is always, this is Hyland's point, that Plato is trying to always get us to inhabit, and we don't want to inhabit the metaxou, the in-between, but we have to inhabit the tonos of being finite transcendent. We are always capable of transcendence, but if we only focus on that, we fall prey to hubris and tyranny. But because we are always, we never transcend such that we stop being mortals. We never stop being finite beings, right? But if we only hold on to our finitude, then we'll fall into despair and be oppressed in servitude right? And so you have to hold the tension. And that's what the logos is. It's the holding, the gathering together of those two things. And this is how it aligns with maturity. Maturity is like Russen's idea, facing up to reality. I like the term "facing up to reality." It's got all that nuance in it. And the idea then is that there is a kind of suffering that is inevitable to logos. There's a kind of, and Socrates makes this very clear. There's a kind of suffering that's within even love. Because it's always metaxou, it's always finite transcendence. We are called into transcendence by love, but love never calls us from our humanity, from our embodied humanity, because then if it does, it becomes something horrible and horrific. Right? This is the tragic. This is Kurtz, right? Kurtz in The Heart of Darkness. He was everybody says he was an extraordinary man, and the thing is, but he lets go of his mortality, and he falls into the horror, right?
Well, I had this thought not that long ago, and it was because of a conversation with my mother, and this is to pick up on the suffering point, where we recently had a child, and I was realizing what that entails to have a child and to bring up a child in the world. And my mother had 9 of them. I'm one of 9, and and so I wrote her a letter for Mother's Day, and in it I thanked her for the sacrifice that it took for her to give life to all 9 of us, and how that, she spent her life doing that.
There's nothing else you could do.
So I wanted to honor that. And later we were having a conversation, and she said, I thought about that a lot, and it wasn't a sacrifice. Like, looking back, I don't look at it as a sacrifice at all. I don't know what else I would have done. There's nothing more valuable that I could have done. And I thought about that for a while, because I thought, well, it was a sacrifice for her at the time, but it's not looking back.
Yeah.
There's something about like this suffering of sacrifice, right? Like, I experience it as a suffering when there's parts of me dying such that I can fit to the world. I experience that as a kind of sacrifice and a kind of suffering. But when it has happened, it changes in my memory, let's say, or in my experience, where the quality or the taste of it, when I look back on it, is no longer that of sacrifice and suffering. It's a sense of joy and freedom and healing.
And I think that's because where you're looking at it from has changed. And all of perspective is framing, right? So the whole information set looks different, even though the individual pieces are the same.
Excellent.
The integration is completely different.
Exactly right. Exactly. Excellent. Well said.
And John, I got to speak to something you were touching on earlier, because I had this very profound experience recently where I've been trying to identify more and more as the through line, less and less as the self, and more as just I am the through line.
Oh, that's cool.
Of the universe itself, of myself, of every layer of reality, the through line.
Right.
And I think I was thinking about, and you guys said it all, each in your own languages, back to back, and my mind just exploded because for Ken, this was like the death and resurrection. But ultimately what we're talking about is smooth cycling of the processors, right? So the juggling, the hyperbolic juggling of the trinity of processors that we have, okay, getting their flow cycling smoothly in a sense. But the thought that I had was, what happens to the through line at a polarity in a reciprocally forming object when you're the through line, which is all the ways that you can move around and through something to the other side of it? What happens at that polarity is they all collide and they come back.
Yes.
So the gestalt is the through line coming back through itself, and suffering is the resistance that you're having to the thing colliding with itself, and that's your experience. That's your thoughts and feelings. You're crashing into each other, coming from different sides, and not integrating well. And you later are able to reintegrate that information and holistically hold it. And whenever you do that, it's beautiful. The lack of beauty is just a lack of integration in a sense. It's an inappropriate integration if it's not beautiful.
Mm-hmm. You're gonna love maybe it's episode 15 of After Socrates.
Oh, nice.
Because the argument is the whole idea of wisdom as learned ignorance comes to culmination in Nicholas of Cusa, and Nicholas of Cusa has the coincidence of the greatest opposites within infinity, and what he's basically proposing is that God is the ultimate through line through all the polarities, so that I think is going to ring really well with you. I should start getting ready to go now, gentlemen. Okay. But I'm looking forward to following up on this at some point.
Well, I know your time is I have only, I think I have less than 500 subscribers to my channel, and I already have, like my time that can be allotted to online is vanishes so quickly, and I can't imagine someone who's having the kind of footprint that I'm beyond glad to see that your work is having, and I hope that it continues to get
thank you
much more significant.
I thank you for saying that. My humble but hopefully honest aspiration is that I can live up to the responsibility of that footprint, and so I'm building a team around me with the help of some very excellent people. So I really want to learn from some of the mistakes that some other people have made, and try to build structures that are not completely in my control, so that I can be held properly accountable. It is in many different sources. I'm now seeing the emergence of a consensus that the best translation of logos is the ability to give an account. It's a kind of accountability as the primary thing that logos is. And then we can think about accounting as that organizing, right, and the collecting and gathering together, but also responsibility.
Holding together.
Yeah, all of it.
The form within which all else forms. Yeah.
Very much. So I'm hoping that I can do this as virtuously as possible. It's a significant concern for me, but having these kinds of conversations help. Please let me know when this video is up, and like your others, Ken, I'll promote it.
Wonderful.
And make sure that people get it, and that way, Steve, more people start to get introduced to you and get you into this too. Awesome. The people of good thought and good faith should be coming into this little corner of the internet, as many as we possibly can. And then Ken, I'll reach out to Madeline, and I really want to get the next thing with David Schindler going.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming, and this has been lovely.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure meeting you, Steve. I love the taste of your mind. Your mind is this very open and expansive, but very, very, like, I don't know what to call, not smooth, because that's trivializing, but there's a fluency of moving through the space of your mind that I really appreciate.
So well, I look forward to running with you again, John. I think this conversation to me was I think the potential further conversations is so exciting to me because there's so much more we could talk about, and I could feel the resonance in it. So it's just a beautiful conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Take care, John.